Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In reality, the industry's always been a changing industry. We know this. It's always dynamic, always moving, always changing. But it seems to be, just recently, it is going nuts. Everything seems to be in flux. Everything seems to be changing. So what we're going to try and do is kind of look at some of these things and some of these themes. A bit about me. I'm a non-exec on the governance team at Pathway. I'm also an independent management consultant. When asked what I do for a living, cat wrangler mainly, trying to get people all kind of herded in the same direction. Everybody's independent, so trying to get everybody running in the same direction sometimes is a little bit tough, but that's what I do, and that's how I do it. So, where are we now? EFA, SFA merged. This is probably common knowledge to a lot of you. Non-DAS apprenticeship registrations was cancelled. The tendering round that was just recently submitted and put together, that's now gone. We're expecting that to come back in July, but it'll only be potentially for levy. That's what the rumours are telling us. We've got transitional contracts for existing apprenticeship providers. That is ongoing. Everybody there got relatively small contracts. In terms of growth bids, there's been quite a lot of growth bids gone in. To date, I think there's about 42 that have actually been passed through as successful. So providers are actually really struggling still to increase the size of their contracts back to where they are. I suspect some of that is around motivation from the ESFA. Of the levy employers, about 20% of those have registered for levy. So while they'll be paying their money every month, only about 20% of levy-paying employers have actually registered to actually be able to use the levy that they're actually paying. I suspect the withholding funding from more direct non-levy-paying employers might be to encourage providers themselves to go after the levy employers, because that's where the business is right now. We've got interesting things with the employer contribution. That's now a reality. That's a tough subject. I guess we'll pick up on that in a little while. And we actually have guidance this week on the 20% off-the-job training. And that is a big subject for everybody. So for those of you that are practitioners in the room, that's going to be a case of you're going to have to look at what you do and how you do it. If you're managers, then you've got to look at how you approach this. This is going to be a seriously interesting subject. And again, perhaps talk about that and the impact of that as we go through. I think the one thing that is clear is that people are going to be your competitive advantage, and we can't do things the way that we've always done things. So, you're not delivering an apprenticeship now by turning up an hour a month, go and do a little bit of work, an observation, and then walk away. There has to be something more meaningful in it and behind that. We've also got apprenticeship reform, so we've got standards kicking off, the transition from frameworks, apprenticeship frameworks to apprenticeship standards. That's quite key. There are some major problems sitting underneath that, not least of which is the fact that there's 171 apprenticeship standards currently published. There are 71 endpoint assessment organisations that have been subjects covered in endpoint assessment organisations. So there is a big gaps of who's actually going to do the endpoint assessment. Interestingly, just on some numbers for those of you that are interested in numbers, if you've got 3 million apprenticeships to be delivered over the next 5 years, that's 600,000 per year. I'd like to start some maths. That's 50,000 per month. And if you assume that the average assessment programme is going to be 2 days worth of actual work, that's 100,000 man days per month in assessment alone. Now obviously there's going to be variations between subjects, but you're going to have people that fail, people that pass, people that do not show, that do not attend the actual process. So there's going to be some serious things to coordinate, not least of which is that we are now no longer examining our own tests. So we're going very much now to what would be a DVLA style driving test approach, where you learn to drive with the driving instructor, and now you're going to be tested by an examiner who doesn't know you, doesn't know your capabilities, and doesn't know if you're having an off day. So there's some serious changes underpinning that. In interesting thing with apprenticeship standards is that there's not necessarily a QCF wrapped up inside all qualifications, and that itself makes it quite interesting. They've almost taken the standards out of framework. So where a framework is, in theory, a framework, and you then put flesh on the bones, the standards you would assume would actually have more detail, but in actual fact they've taken most of that detail away from it, stripped that out. While it gives good flexibility and you can meet the employer's requirements, on the downside it actually takes away the structures and the routines and the rigour with which you do things, and so it makes it a little bit more questionable. So that's kind of where we are with that. That's created a few challenges. The levy employer engagement is key among that. Employer engagement is key. In short, if you've got the hearts and minds of the employer, then you are in a good position. If you don't have the hearts and minds of the employer, you are going to be struggling somewhat. In order to get the hearts and minds, we've still got to convince the employer that they've got 10% to pay and physically pay into the process. Not only have we got to convince the employer to pay money towards the qualification, we've actually then got compliance issues that we need to look at, because compliance is going to be key. We are going to have to evidence that money coming into the organisation and going out. Now, why is that difficult? Well, if you invoice on a per learner basis, you might be taking that payment over 12 instalments, or you might be taking it on a quarterly instalment, and evidencing that is going to be tough. Further, if you're working with a levy employer on the 10%, once they've spent their levy, where they don't get charged the employer contribution, anything over their levy, they then pay for. And again, how do we know which bits we actually have to invoice for once they've actually spent their levy? Because that's on their dashboard, and what sort of access do we have as a provider to that information? So lots of compliance and audit issues and information to go with that particular challenge. And then the off-the-job stuff. In reality, they've got a little slide in a bit, they're just with a little graphic on it that I'll share with you. But it's not just the 10% that employers are having to pay. They are now paying wages while the person is taking time off for study. And that is going to be an additional on-cost for employers. And again, their business development team, you are going to be out there trying to convince the employers of why this is a good deal. So there are some opportunities wrapped up within where we are at the moment. There's a lot of ESF programs out there, and at the moment those ESF programs, some are succeeding, but there are several primes out there with shortfalls. There is opportunity for the smaller providers, the subcontract providers, for them to get involved in the processes and actually look to business. A difficulty with advanced learning loans, we're not being able to subcontract advanced learning loans nowadays. That is creating some problems for new providers whose lifeblood was purely that. We've got to look at diversifying and moving that particular agenda forward. The collaboration and partnership is going to be a strength, and again, one of my colleagues, wherever he is, Duncan, is going to talk to you a little bit more about that a little bit later on. But there is real value in that, and that's something that we need to actually look at. So, breaking it down, what I did is I've broken it down into how we might address and target and tackle some of these issues. You've got to deploy the best people. You've got to get the best people in order to actually make this happen. Your business development have got to up their game for employer engagement. At Pathway, we know we are now having to have different conversations with our employers. We're not going in and say, here, have one of these, it's free. Employers aren't looking at their apprenticeship programs as CSR policies anymore. It used to be that employers it makes me feel good to give an apprenticeship a chance and things like that. Now it's got cost, it's got to give commercial impact. So recruitment has to be more effective, and your HR needs to be more effective. You've got to get the right people, and that is going to be key. Alongside that, your delivery staff, you've got to redesign your programs. You've got to add value. You've got to make the employers want the product for the product. It's got to have impact for their businesses, and it's got to make sense. And then leadership, you've got to have better governance and planning, because this is tough. This is a massive change, and you've got to have some serious change planning going on. And that is going to be a central element of what you're doing. You can't do business the way that you did business. I mean, we could talk about other areas. Rather than apprenticeships, we could talk about health and well-being. That's still slow and ongoing. DWP, there is work regulated training at the moment that you can actually pitch in for. ESF, we've got Brexit coming up. That's going to have an impact on most funding streams that have got co-funded via that. And obviously, depending on where that goes, there are going to be some longer-term impacts. And that's kind of what I'm saying with these is the longer-term impact that goes with it. We need to create the value. I said I had a little graphic on the green box, so you may or may not be able to see from where you're sitting. What that does is, on the 20% rule for employer, off-the-job training, in context, if you have an apprentice that is paid £3.50 an hour and they work 37.5 hours a week, and you assume they get 4 weeks holiday a year, they will work 1,800 hours a year. That would require 20% would be 360 hours of off-the-job training. Now think about that for a minute. One, there is a cost to the employer of £1,260 for the physical wages while they're doing that off-the-job training. And the second part of it is, what do you do? It might, for those of you that have actually read the new guidance, you will notice every illustration they give you in that new guidance is actually based on a professional qualification, so accountancy, engineering, things with high levels of learning as part of the process, solicitors, construction, that kind of thing. What do you do if you work in lower skilled environments at lower levels? So if you're health and social care, for example, one of the projects we're dealing with at Pathway is that we deliver health and social care, and somebody moving into health and social care, we calculated, has genuinely about 168 hours worth of training in their first year before we start to struggle. We've got to push that to 360. And so it's what do we do with that other 192 hours to actually hit the 360 hours because they work full time. Other interesting questions are, what happens if we have somebody who works 30 hours and somebody who works 60 hours because they put in they work more hours? Because the guidance again says 20% of their working time. Now, do we count normal time? And if you've got somebody on 0-hour contracts or you've got people on shift patterns, that creates problems. As a cost, if you had somebody on £7.30 an hour, the cost to the employer would be £2,628. So we've got some meaningful questions as an industry and a sector to answer, and we need to get to grips with those questions and actually do that. And that's where our people, our leaders, need to start thinking about what's our game plan, what are we doing about how we're going to sell these products, how we're going to engage with employers, how we're going to navigate our way through these problems and these issues, and more importantly from a delivery point of view. So for those of you that are deliverers in the room, then how are you going to get your hour totals up? And putting it in context, and I believe there might be 1 or 2 colleges in the room, even a college that does day release 39 weeks of year technically would not tick the box for 20%, because a college will work 9 till 3:30, the person works 9 till 5 o'clock, they've done 39 weeks, not 48 weeks. So even a college would seriously have to think, they can't just look at, well, we do day release 1 day a week, we've ticked all the boxes, we're good to go. On a technicality, they would need to think or revisit potentially where they're going and what they're doing with that. We've got to create value. An employer has got to see something tangible. They can't look at it as they're just helping somebody that's come into their organisation and feel good about themselves. They've actually got to have a business benefit. And the idea of the Richards report that came out was to start thinking about education for employers from classroom to boardroom level, so from level 2 to level 6, and put an end-to-end process together. More importantly, even the work that we do around this, so the work that we might do through employability programs, that's got to be employer loaded, because we've now got to start putting people in the right place for the employers. So having the employer and an employer's view at the centre of what we're doing is really key. And we need to start thinking more like employers. Very often we are engaged to deliver apprenticeships or skill support for the workforce programs or whatever particular program that you might have at a low level. You know, it'll be a manager who wants who will sign off for an apprenticeship. That can't happen. We now need to be talking to the finance directors, the HR directors. It needs to be a much higher level conversation that's now going on. We're going to have to adopt a consultative style approach to what we do. And that is key to where we're going. And there's a lot out there at the moment. There's a lot of employer competitions going on. I'm doing quite a lot with the NHS right now. They put together an approved supplier list. Not only have you got to be on the register of apprenticeship training organisations, you've actually also got to be on their preferred supplier list. Once you're on their preferred supplier list, then you've got to complete a mini competition for each of the particular NHS trusts or hospitals. That, for those of you that are interested, and my colleagues at the back there will probably be able to tell you this, at this moment in time, right down to one hospital wanting one apprentice, in order to win that business in a mini competition, there are 16 questions, narrative questions, each requiring 500-word answers. So whether you're delivering one apprenticeship, 20 apprenticeships, or 60 apprenticeships, if you want to win that business, there is a real burden to actually what you need to do to go out there and win that. And there are a lot of councils out there that are doing this same stuff right now. There's 4 councils south of London that have pretty much picked up and clubbed together for that. I work a lot in Nottingham, and Nottinghamshire County Council has linked with Cornwall Council. Not entirely sure how that happened, but they are now putting together their infrastructure of their workforce development. And I don't know if you saw it, and it's an interesting thing, I'll ask a question. There was a Ministry of Justice Crown Commercial Service tender went out and has just recently closed, and that was for £400 million worth of apprenticeship delivery. Did anybody in this room actually pitch into that before the deadline? I'll tell you that as a no. I have yet to find anybody who actually responded to that particular tendering opportunity as a provider. And that's interesting because that's £400 million worth of business, and as far as I'm aware, I can't find a single provider that actually went anywhere near it. Okay, the final thing then, I guess, is diversify. Now this is a dilemma for me, because when I work with companies, I'm always urging them to work within their skill set. And the problem I've got is jack of all trades and eggs in one basket. And that is a real dilemma for training providers at the moment. Because of the changing nature of the industry, and because of the lag time between contracts running together, there is a real problem where diversification potentially is a strategy that you guys need to consider. Now let me put it in context. If you're a work program provider, or were a work program provider, the Working Health Successor Program is still not there. Nearly 2 years later, what was is still not, to what will be, the gap is 2 years. The problem is that we're in a contract tail. So what that means is, work program is dropping off, no new referrals, and over time, that's flatlining. There becomes a point where it is not economically viable to continue running the offices and the staff for that contract, and you have to make hard choices. There is a lag. Now what do you do with those people? You either transfer them onto other funding streams and doing other work, or you are actually then closing offices and discarding people. And it's a tough call to make, because what you're doing is, and from a leader's perspective, you are letting talent that you've groomed, nurtured, built, walk away. So all that time to develop an assessor or a trainer, which takes years to bring them through the process, you then have to let them go because you're of the work structures. And it's not just work program, that's just one instance. ESF programs, if you recall, there was a big lag between old ESF programs and then the launch of the new ESF programs. And it's a tradition for our sector, and it is a problem. Diversification does offer us a way of dealing with that, having more funding streams, more funding lines, being more involved in the processes. But conversely, the added complexity means that we are busier, harder, and have more complex organisations. Training providers, even the smallest training providers, have business systems that you would not find in £40 million turnover businesses. with policies, procedures, and all the infrastructure that you guys put in place in order to operate even at the most basic level in this sector. And that is something that we have to do, because there is a cost to that. There is a cost to the compliance. There is a cost to actually having these systems and these quality standards. So, we need to look at where the opportunities are and diversification. There is apprentice assessment organisations. You can become one of those. You just can't use it to deliver your own learning, your own endpoint assessment. It is an opportunity. ATAs, apprenticeship training agencies, again, another potential opportunity. You've got the DWP work-related services, DWP work and health, via primes, when that actually eventually kind of hits the floor and hits the floor running. We're still waiting on AEB. That should have been out end of June. We're still waiting on the outcome of that. Hopefully we'll hear about that one any day. So we've got lots of stuff that is tied up, old programs that were running, now on pause, and we are now translating to that. So we are a sector in change. And really, I suppose to summarise, our people are really our most important asset in any change environment. We need them on the right page, doing the right things at the right time. People, however, very often don't like change. Trainers like to train the way they train because they have their systems, their processes, their lesson plans, their structures, their strategies. They are now going to go out of their comfort zones because they're going to have to build programs that are 360 hours plus long. Interestingly, 540 hours is considered to be full-time education. 360 hours is actually only 20% of a person's normal working day. And I don't think there has been any real thought about how we're going to evidence that. So compliance, again, big areas for us to actually work on. So that, I think, brings me to the end of where I am. Thank you very much for your time.
Think apprenticeship. Think pathway.